we'll be live on YouTube in just a second.
Thank you. Sounds great.
Okay. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Politics and Prose Live. My name is Beth Wong. I'm an event coordinator at PNP, and we thank you so much for joining us here this afternoon to celebrate the release of ArtCurious, Stories of the Unexpected, Slightly Odd, and Strangely Wonderful in Art History, a new book based on the eponymous podcast by Jennifer Dasal. At any time during the event today, you can click on the link, which I'll be posting in the chat, to purchase copies of the book on PNP's website. Your purchases come to the store at a very difficult time for small businesses across the country. So in addition to growing your own library, a book sale from Politics and Prose means that we at the store are able to keep bringing you content like this. We're so proud of it, and we hope that you'll support it with a book sale. You can ask our author a question today by submitting it to the Q&A box, the button for which can be found near the bottom of your screen. Do be sure to put your question in the Q&A box and not in the chat to make sure that your author sees it. I don't want to waste any more time getting to the main event. So Jennifer Dasal is the curator of modern and contemporary art at the North Carolina Museum of Art in Raleigh. She's also the host of the independent podcast ArtCurious, which has been named a best podcast by The Oprah Magazine and PC Magazine. I am so excited for this talk today. So welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you. Thank you so much to everybody at PNP for having me. And thank you all for spending your beautiful Saturday afternoon with me. I really appreciate it. So I want to start talking today. We're going to devote probably about half the time to your questions. So please feel free to, again, put those in the Q&A box and ask me anything, either about my background or my work in a museum, about the podcast, and of course, about the book. So as Beth said, I'm Jennifer Dasal. I am a curator at the North Carolina Museum of Art in Raleigh, North Carolina. And I've been working there about 12 years. And in that time, I love it every single day. And in that time, it feels like I usually meet people who are on two different camps. I either meet people who say that they are art people and that they love art, they read about it all the time, they come to museums and galleries as much as they can, and they just want it all. They want to know everything there is about it. And then it seems like I meet people who are on the other side completely, who, when I bump into them at the museum, would say things like, I'm just here because my mom wanted me to come with her today and I'm not really an art person, or I'm here only because I hear that you have one of the best hamburgers in town at the cafe. And it's very rare that I seem to meet people who split the difference and fall into the middle. And I always tell people that, of course, I love meeting the people who say that they're art folks, because I get it and I am with them. They're like my people, is what I say. But just as much, I like meeting the people who say that art isn't really for them, because I feel like I have this sympathy, because I used to be exactly that way. So I mentioned very briefly in the book, in the introduction portion, that I began ArtCurious really because I wanted to be able to share the kind of stories about art and art history that I have learned over the years and that I've ended up loving too. Because I used to not really like art at all. When I was growing up, I'm originally from California. And when I was growing up, I had background in art in that we occasionally went to a museum for a field trip with school groups. Same things like that, but I didn't really have any interest in art. I certainly had no classes or anything involving art history at all. And at best, the only thing I had was the occasional art making class when I was in grade school. And for me, that was pure torture, because we weren't given a lot of training or education. It was just sort of like, do this and make this thing and make it as well as you can. I tell a story in my book about this really horrific moment when I was in grade school, where an art teacher came in and she began every single class the same way, which is that she wanted us to do something called the circle exercise. And so with just a pencil and an eraser, and that's it, and just our bare hands, we couldn't use any other tools, no rulers, no compass, no nothing. We had to be able to draw a perfect circle freehand. And so she would put 5 minutes on a timer. And in that time, we could erase as much as we want, But at the very end, we were supposed to be able to come with a perfect circle. And then to make it so much more painful, we were given a letter grade on it. So I, at best, remember getting a C+ one day and feeling like I had just struck the lottery. Like that was the best I ever got. So for me, I learned for some reason that that was what art was. And so I very much did not like it. So I spent a lot of my time when I was growing up and going into high school and early part of college really avoiding art because that's what it felt like to me. So it wasn't until I accidentally, long story short, was asked to be in an art history class because I could not get into a humanities course to save my life during my freshman year. And a course counselor told me that, you know, a lot of people take art history. Let's just see if there's any openings. And she registered me pretty much without my approval or interest. And all of a sudden I found myself taking your basic art history 101 class. And a few months later, I sort of found that I was so inspired by the stories that I was reading and hearing about in art history class that I would spend my off time reading more about it. So I would read ahead in my textbook like a complete nerd. And I loved it because the stories that I was learning about behind those works of art, it wasn't just droning on. I had a great teacher who made you really excited about what works of art mean, not only for civilizations, you know, thousands of years ago, but what they mean for us today. And that started me on this path. I ended up going through college and grad school and until all the way up until I went into the museum world working as a curator, having this great background in art history. But I've always noticed along the way that there are still those two camps of people who say, I love art or I hate art. I'm totally interested and I completely don't get it. And there's, again, not a lot of people in between. Every once in a while, I'll meet somebody who says, oh, I like it, kind of. Let's maybe talk more about it. But it's very rare. It usually seems to be the two ends of the spectrum. So about 4 years ago, I decided that I wanted to do a podcast simply because I love podcasts. I listen to them all the time. I often tell people that they're kind of like the background noise to my day. I am when I was driving to work, when I'm not in my house, I would listen to them going to and from work, dropping my son off at school or picking him up. I would be listening. I listen when I go on runs. I listen when I do the dishes. It's just the background sounds of my life. And I like to say that it's kind of like grown-up story time. So I always feel so immersed in these stories. And there are a good number of art podcasts out there, obviously not as many as like true crime or things like that, but there are some really wonderful ones. But what I noticed was a lot of them are more straightforward in that they might be interviews with artists or other people involved in the art world, or they're more conversational in format, or there are kind of more that traditional art history storytelling, not storytelling, but basically telling you what this particular artwork means and why it's important and asking your opinion on it. It's more akin to your basic art history course. And I knew I wanted to do something a little bit different because, again, in my experience, having something be a story or a narrative that you can grasp onto, for me, that has made all the difference. And it's turned me as a non-art person into an art person. So I came up with the idea to have this podcast, and I called it ArtCurious, the unexpected, slightly odd, and strangely wonderful in art history. And part of the reason I did that was because I wanted to be able to tell those stories, again, that you might not normally hear about in your art history classes. So things, again, that would be unexpected. And I am somebody who likes the weirder side of things. So not necessarily scary or grotesque, although sometimes I can be interested in that depending, but I just wanted to hear the things that make you kind of lean in closer and say, oh, that's not what I thought you would say at all. Tell me more. And there are plenty of stories about art that fall into that category. And then my last segment was I wanted to talk about what I call the strangely wonderful, because I didn't want it to be dark all the time. I wanted it to be some fun surprises about art, again, that would hopefully get you more interested. And my thought is that if along the way you learned something about art, that was gravy, because my number one thing was that I just wanted to be able to tell you fun stories that are part of this world that I feel very privileged that I get to work and play in. So the first story that I ever covered on the the ArtCurious podcast, be great if I could even learn the name of my own show, was that long story, I'm going to give you the background on it. I was on a business trip for the North Carolina Museum of Art, and I had a layover in Paris for a few days because someone has to do it. It was great. And so I use that time usually whenever I'm on a trip, whether it be a business trip or a personal trip just for fun. I just love to hit as many museums and galleries as I can, just because that's fun for me as much as it's good for my job. And so I decided that I wanted to go to the Louvre, which was a museum that I had not been at in probably a good 10, 15 years. I'd only been one other time up to that point in my life. And so I was sitting on an airplane and just sort of dreaming to myself about what art I was going to see. And I said to myself, oh, it'll be great to go see the Mona Lisa again at the Louvre. That's nice. I haven't been able to see her in a while. That would be fun. And whenever I think of the Mona Lisa, the first thing that I think of every single time is this story that my art history professor told me way back when I was in college. And it was such a jarring moment because it was, again, your basic art history course where you're learning all the rough generalities of art. And when we were talking about the Mona Lisa, she was talking about techniques of sfumato that Leonardo uses in the background to create kind of that atmospheric smokiness that makes it look like a real scene in the background. Of course, we talked about her mysterious smile and why people are so interested. And at the very end, she sort of paused and said, yep, so, she's based in the Louvre. You can go see her if you ever get the chance to go to Paris, go by the Louvre, you can go see her. And then she paused for probably no more than a few seconds. And then she said, or it's fine if you don't end up going there. It's not a big deal because the one that's on view at the Louvre is totally fake. And I sat back in my chair in our lecture hall and basically thought to myself, what are you talking about? For me, it seemed like the most conspiracy theory of all conspiracy theories that you could possibly have about art. And this was coming from a professor who ended up being one of my mentors in college. And she's very no nonsense, very straightforward, and not somebody who seemed like she would be very conspiratorially minded. And so that story really struck with me and just has never left me because it seems so weird. And I've never heard anybody really proclaim that ever since. I do remember that when she very briefly was discussing why she thought that, she talked about the fact that the Mona Lisa had been stolen twice. And the first time it was by a known art forger who was working in cahoots with a major art thief. And then in World War II, it was stolen again, so on and so forth. And that was kind of all that she said. And I never had really the opportunity to go and ask her to explain more. So again, it just remained this mystery in my mind. And on this trip to France, where I did indeed go get to pay my respects to the Mona Lisa, I would spend some of my off time at night in my hotel room just Googling around about the history of the Mona Lisa. And that was the moment that really solidified ArtCurious for me, because the more I read about this thief, when the painting itself was stolen, especially in 1911, its most famous theft, I thought, how come more people don't know about this? It's not a rare story by any means. This was a very famous moment in 20th century art and 20th century history, really. And it has had long ramifications for art because it changes the way that we are able to interact as people with art. And so I thought, this story has to be told. I know it's been told many times in books, but I wanted it to reach a little bit of a wider audience, especially for someone like me, where I'm in my head all the time listening to podcasts. And I thought this could make a great story. So I began the podcast in 2016 with that first episode, kind of on a whim, really. I did it without having any background in podcasting or experience in anything audio related. So I definitely learned on the fly as I was going. And I think hopefully our our podcast has improved over the years, but it has been so much fun. It's been such a joy. And for me, the most exciting parts have been when people have reached out to me. I was just saying to Beth before we went live here that sometimes podcasting can be a little bit like shouting into a void, because you don't get that immediate response like you do if you are in the audience and speaking and giving a lecture to somebody, or even just sharing a story with your friend in person. You get that moment where you have that connection and you can see if somebody is enjoying a story or not. With a podcast, it's obviously very different. I record something and then I send it out into the world and I hope that people like it and listen. So for me, it's been the best part is when somebody will email me or be in contact through my website or on social media and say that they enjoy it, even in just a small way, even if it just helps make their afternoon go by a little bit more, or it gives them something to listen to when they are commuting into work, for example. So that has been the most gratifying part. Then about 2 years or so, about 2.5 years into the podcast, and I could have never known that I would have gone on this long. It was such a, when I started the podcast, it was such a, just a let's see what happens, spontaneous decision that I had no idea that 4 years later I would be sitting here talking to you today. So about 2 years ago at this point, my husband sat down with me and he said, "You've done all this work, you have all this material that you've researched and written," because every single episode begins with a script. So nothing is really offhand. I write everything out. And so it's the equivalent of when I'm in season, I typically do about 7 or 8 episodes per season. And each episode is basically like doing a term paper every 2 weeks. And so each paper is about, I'd say, 8 to 10 pages single spaced. So it's by no means book length, but it is also a lot of work and a lot of research and a lot of time that goes through into making this show. So my husband sat me down and he said, "Look at all this stuff you've covered. You should do a book." And I thought that sounded ridiculous, because I thought, who writes books? Amazing magic people. It didn't seem like something that I could do, because for me, especially for somebody who loves books and loves reading, it just seemed like a fantasy. So he honestly had to wear me down a little bit. It was something that he would very gently nudge me to do every few months, I would say, until probably about a year later, I said, "Okay, fine, maybe I'll look into it." And at that point, everything happened very quickly. I was very lucky in that I found a great agent and I wrote a proposal and he helped me hone it. And then I'm extremely lucky in that I found Penguin Books, who ended up wanting to do something with me, and found the best publisher and best agent, best editor and team in the world. And that is how this book came about. So it's been incredibly exciting. One of the things that's been really fun about this book is that the majority of the stories in it are things that I have not yet covered on the podcast, or have not or will not cover on the podcast. So they are new and fresh to the book. There are a few things that I did cover in the podcast itself, like the Mona Lisa story, talking about Van Gogh's death, for example, and a couple other things that are in this book. And then there are some smaller things that I've discussed more like in bonus episodes, like the story of Marcel Duchamp and Elsa von Freytag-Loringhoven, who was a German baroness who has been rumored of being a possible collaborator or creator of Duchamp's most famous work, Fountain, which is really just an upturned urinal. So I covered that in the podcast, but the book really allowed me to be able to dig in a little bit more and tell the stories more fully. So that for me has been so fun, because I learn hopefully as much as you do as listeners and readers, because a lot of this some of them begin as stories that I already know. And then others begin as just something that I hear about that I think sounds interesting. And I go, like the very last chapter in the book is about Andy Warhol. And I learned about the fact that he had time capsules when I was listening to an episode of This American Life. So it's all these little moments that have built up stories I remember and stories that I just happen upon, that have then become part of this book. So I want to go ahead and read you a little bit from it. I'm actually going to read you from that Andy Warhol chapter to give you a little bit of background. So this is from chapter 12 of ArtCurious, Stories of the Unexpected, Slightly Odd, and Strangely Wonderful in Art History. And this is from the chapter I'm calling Toenails and Junk Mail, Andy Warhol's Time Capsules. I was a podcast fan long before I started my own show, binging the likes of NPR's Fresh Air and Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me, as well as Pottercast, one of the first Harry Potter fan downloads, nerd alert, for years. But an all-time favorite in the pre-serial era was, and still is, Ira Glass's This American Life. I know it's not earth-shattering, out-of-the-box confessions, as TAL has long been critically lauded and a beloved radio program. I recall one segment in particular that had an especially interesting 11-minute segment. In Your Junk in a Box, contributor and TAL cult favorite Starlee Kine covered the incredible work being done by a group of folks in Pittsburgh who spend their time cataloging an insanely high number of time capsules. 610 of them, to be exact. That number alone, and the fact that there are people who spend their workdays studying actual time capsules, was intriguing enough. But I was flabbergasted when I learned that these time capsules were all created and kept by a single person, and that person wasn't some random guy. This obsessive capsule creator was none other than Andy Warhol. As an art historian and a hardworking curator, I was fascinated and not a little bit ashamed that I hadn't known about Andy Warhol's time capsules. And yes, that's what he called them, even though they aren't the bury in the backyard type of time capsules you're probably imagining right now. But I take solace in the knowledge that only a small number of people, mainly his assistants, knew of Warhol's time capsules, and his feverish collecting and containing was largely kept a secret during his lifetime. It might seem as if these capsules are of minor interest to those who are fans of Warhol's pop art, but in fact, the opposite should be true. Taken together, these 610 capsules can be considered one stellar, strange, unwieldy work by one of the most unique minds in modern art. It's hard to imagine a world without Andy Warhol. He's considered one of the two most influential and popular artists of the 20th century, alongside Pablo Picasso. And like Picasso, he's got great name and brand recognition. Mention Andy Warhol to a passerby, and they probably can either visualize his iconic art, think garish silkscreen paintings of Marilyn Monroe or Jackie Kennedy, or lines of canvases depicting Campbell's soup cans, or even envision the artist himself with his all black hipster clothes, dark sunglasses, and shock of white hair. He vastly affected the art world, but also extended far beyond it, inspiring musicians, filmmakers, fashion and graphic designers, and more. And we can't escape him, though not many art aficionados want to escape him. As Phoebe Hoban, the biographer of Warhol acolyte Jean-Michel Basquiat, wrote, quote, "To legions of art students, Warhol was the white-wigged Wizard of Oz, his famous career a grail to every MFA and struggling downtown artist in residence," unquote. Many Warhol fans gravitate toward that white wig, his mysterious and eccentric personality, and the glam of the factory, his ultra-cool studio cum den of artists and aesthetes, which was frequently filled to the brim with silvery tinfoil, heroin-chic models, and drugs. But Warhol's beginnings were rather humble in comparison to the lifestyle afforded by his meteoric rise. He was born Andrew Warhola in Pittsburgh on August 6, 1928, and though American-born, Andy was deeply affected by his outsider status of his immigrant parents, who moved from Slovakia before Andy's birth and maintained very strong ties to their Slovakian roots. In fact, like many newcomers to America, the Warhola family specifically chose their new home for its Slovakian population, with Pittsburgh as the epicenter of a sizable enclave of Eastern European immigrants. To young Andy, this probably felt a little bit like belonging and yet not belonging. He was American, sure, but also not quite by virtue of his family ties. This sensation of being an outsider persisted throughout much of Warhol's childhood and was made more intense by bouts of severe illness. In 1936, when he was 8 years old, he contracted Sydenham's chorea, also known as St. Vitus's disease, a rare and sometimes fatal disease of the nervous system that causes involuntary movements in one's limbs. He was bedridden for several months during that year and continued to have periods of confinement throughout his youth. Such ailments kept him separate from other children, as he missed large portions of schooling and probably contributed to a developing fear of doctors and hospitals that ballooned to severe hypochondria in later life. But there was a silver lining. To cope with his illness and feelings of isolation, Andy deeply bonded with his mother, who shared her love of art and taught him to draw so he could pass the time on bed rest. Around the same period, Mama Warhol bought her son his first camera. Drawing and photography soon became the young Warhol's two biggest passions and would ultimately change his life and art history. So that's just a couple pages in the my first book. So I hope that you've had the chance to buy a copy if you haven't already, or to find one either online at Politics and Prose or elsewhere, or from your local library. And I've gotten a lot of questions recently about what format you can find the book in. So it is available not only in physical book form, like I have here, but you can also get it online as an ebook. You can have it on Kindle or any other e-reader, or you can have an audiobook version of it, which is one that I actually had the chance to narrate. So that would be really fun. And let me know, please be in touch. Don't be strangers if you end up getting a copy, and let me know what you think of it. So we're about a half hour into the program, and we wanted to make this as interactive as possible today. So Beth, welcome back. Hello. So we would love for you to share your questions. So I see that there are a few in the Q&A already, but please don't be shy. Ask anything. I am very happy to answer today. So what do we want to start with?
Absolutely. We have so many good questions, but to your point about the audiobook,
Yes.
Politics and Prose also partners with Libro FM. It's libro.fm. And you can enter us as your local bookstore to purchase audiobooks, and the link to that is in the chat as well. Along with the hardcover book from P&P. So we have so many good questions. I am going to start with a couple from Brittany, who asked first, who's your favorite modern artist? And I know as a curator, that is like choosing your favorite child.
Oh my gosh, so much.
So if you have maybe a few that you can recommend, and then also she's asking for any documentary recommendations for art history.
Oh, also so good. Oh my goodness. Yeah, it is like asking me what my favorite child is. In terms of modern art, I want to know if you are asking about the period of modernism, or if you're asking about an artist who's working today. The dialogue between what is modern and what is considered contemporary or now, it can be so confusing, I think, for all of us. So even at my own museum, we're talking right now about changing our own verbiage a little bit, even in-house, by saying 20th century art versus 21st century art. So in terms of modern artists, so somebody from the 20th century, especially the earlier part of the 20th century, oh, so good. I would say that right now I've been really interested in learning about more mid-century modern artists. I'm really interested, a lot of work that I've been doing recently for my museum is around Black Mountain College. So this was a school in North Carolina in the mountains near Asheville, if you're familiar with that area, where after probably around the 1930s, 1940s, I might be getting my dates wrong a little bit here, a lot of artists, especially from Nazi Germany and other parts of Western Europe, came to America seeking asylum and escaping the ravages of World War II. And some artists, including Joseph Albers, who's a really important and fantastic modern artist, came to North Carolina, and they established a very experimental art school. And they basically taught really everything, not just visual arts, but also music, dance, photography, everything was taught there. And it became this very unique school that a lot of risks were taken there, a lot of experimentation, and the school is no longer actually a school. It has now basically been turned into a museum. But there were some really fantastic people who were there both as students and as teachers. So people who I've been really interested in recently are Jacob Lawrence, who was there briefly for a while alongside his wife, Gwendolyn Knight. And then also Ruth Asawa, who was a really fantastic sculptor who's originally from California. So I am totally digging them right now. In terms of contemporary art, oh gosh, there's so many to love. Amy Sherald, I love, who did Michelle Obama's portrait at the National Portrait Gallery. Kehinde Wiley, who did Obama's portrait at the National Portrait Gallery. I also love an artist named Hive Karaman, who is originally from Iraq and lives now in Los Angeles. So I recommend looking all of them up. And I can even type in some of their names in the chat box if that's helpful. Oh, and documentaries. This is where I fail a little bit, because sometimes at the end of the day, I don't want to watch something art related because I'm in art all the time. So sometimes I tend to go and I watch like the true crime documentary instead. That being said, there are some really great ones. Wasteland is one that I really like. I think that's what it's called. And it's, oh goodness, except now I forgot his name. It's an artist working in South America. I think he's Brazilian. Pause. I'll get back to you on that one. And I would definitely say Exit Through the Gift Shop, the one about Banksy. That one is fantastic. So definitely check those out for sure. What else? Question.
Awesome. And Wasteland, that artist is Vic
Muniz. Yes, thank you. Thank you.
I got you. I'm on the Google.
I appreciate it.
That actually, so your discussion of the Black Mountain School touches on Angie's question, which is asking about if there are any more like exhibitions or like acquisitions in the works at the North Carolina Museum of Art from Albers, other Bauhaus artists, Mondrian in the permanent section.
I wish we can get a Mondrian. That would be amazing. And I mean, a lot of Bauhaus stuff would be fantastic. It's hard to say actually at this moment, because with the coronavirus, things have been a little bit slower in terms of both exhibitions and especially acquisitions right now, as we're trying to bounce back and recover, just like a lot of cultural institutions. But I can say that we do have a gallery that is dedicated. It's a very small gallery. It's basically one room that's dedicated to Black Mountain College. And my goal is that we continually add to that space. We do have works by Joseph Albers on view at any given time because we have a number of paintings. And then we have a lot of prints and drawings of his, like a couple hundred, that are some that are just now we're starting to show more at the museum in the past 2 years, because for the longest time they were sitting in storage because we didn't have frames to show them in. Now we do have frames, and so it's exciting. It's these little things that make a big difference that then all of a sudden show us what we can do. But there's so many things that I would love. I would love to have more Bauhaus and Mondrians, and I have so much. That's a great question.
And you talked about Ruth Asawa. The USPS just came out with Ruth Asawa stamps. They're the most beautiful stamps I've ever seen in my life.
One moment, I'm going to go get them because I have them. They're so good.
I have them too at my desk.
Oh my gosh. I basically just want to just buy them all. This is my second set. And as you can see, I'm like partway through it already.
They're so stunning.
Oh my gosh, she was such an amazing artist. And she's somebody who I feel like I only personally learned about her and her works maybe 5 years ago. She's really been kind of off the beaten path in art for a long time. So I'm really happy that she's finally coming more to the forefront. But yes, check these out. Ruth Asawa, they are so fabulous.
You can just get them from the post office website. Also plug for the post office. Okay, so next question, which I think is a great one. With arts being cut in schools, how can people still be exposed to art without necessarily having to make considerable personal effort, especially outside of urban areas? And do you think that kind of the decrease in focus on art in schools could increase the number of art haters because they just don't have the exposure?
Oh man, those are such really good questions and really important questions. I think sadly, I do think that it is very detrimental to us as a society that that's one of the first things that's cut. And not just visual arts, but also music and dance, theater programs. These are the first things to go. And we've become a society that I think very strongly, with good reason in many cases, focuses on science, math, engineering. You know, it's the whole STEM thing, which is also super important. But I think that's why initiatives that are looking to add that A in there and making these programs STEAM. So you're adding science, technology, engineering, art, and math. That makes a big difference, because I think there's this thought that anything cultural is maybe not unnecessary, but certainly something that you can get to later after you get the important knowledge. And I don't think that's the case at all, because I think as much as anything else, it helps us to become more well-rounded people. And it also attaches us to our own personal and cultural histories. So art connects us all the way back through time to our earliest of ancestors in a way that, sure, you can get that from studying archaeological artifacts, for example, but the humanity of it, I just don't know. It's something that you cannot do otherwise. The arts just open up the world in a new way. And I think everybody needs the chance to see the world in that and through that lens. So yes, please advocate as much as you can. If you're a parent or a teacher or anybody who knows a parent or a teacher or a child, advocate for the cultural aspect of our world and for arts and music and dance in particular, especially. What was the first part of the question, Beth? I'm sorry.
The first part was, how can we be exposed to art as it's kind of coming out of our schools, and we're not really going to museums in the same way anymore.
That's so good. I love that question. And I think I always get the question of like, do I need to go to the library and check out all the books on art? And I say, if that's of interest to you and you have a local library you can go to, that's great. But one of my favorite things to do is go on Google Arts and Culture. It partners with museums and art institutions from around the world. I mean, we're talking hundreds, if not 1,000 by now. I probably am even more than I'm thinking. And a lot of your most awesome works of art have been replicated there in Ultra HD, so much that you can zoom into every single brush stroke or just the little niches in a sculpture, for example. And the organization sometimes will connect not only videos about the works of art, or again, a high-res photography, visitor photography, information about the artist, information about the works of art, so that it's a free resource where you can really dig in. And again, that's something that if you have internet access, it's just right there in front of you. So I highly recommend that. Just play around. Sometimes I just go on and, there'll be a Ming vase that I've never seen before, and I'll go, ooh, that's cool. And I just zoom in. And sometimes that's just enough for me, because once you see something that you like that might interest you, and it could be as simple as saying, I like the color blue in that picture. Let's check it out a little bit more. For me, that's enough. And that could be what sparks you to learn more and want to keep diving in.
I love that. I love Google Arts and Culture. Definitely a really cool free resource. So you're talking about making the arts accessible. Obviously, that's a big inspiration behind this book project. Reagan asks, how is your institution responding to the recent Black Lives Matter movement and issues of inclusion, diversity, social justice? I think that dovetails in really nicely with accessibility to everyone.
So much. And that is something that, I mean, even far before everything happened this year, that is something that we've been in such discussions about, because art museums in general are very elitist, or we're at least seen as elitist. And in some cases we actually are, and it's awful. And that's something that we feel very strongly should never be the case. So, and something that we have been meaning to do for a long time is really actually get it on paper and write what our actions are and our responses and how we're going to move forward as an institution to be able to better rectify the many gaps that we have in our collection. And I think that it's pretty much really similar across the board for a lot of art institutions. We have been following for far too long the same script, talking about a lot of the same artists, talking about a lot of basically dead white guys. And that's not great. And it does not show the vast picture of art, especially from a Western perspective. We have an entire portion of the world that is sometimes overlooked in art history. And we want to do better. So I definitely think that we have not only started with having more advocacy groups and starting for more institutional education, even just within our internal spheres. And then we're seeking more outdoor help from people who can come in and help us expand the story. It's definitely a long, long process, and we are just at the beginning, but I'm excited to see where we can go because it's necessary. It needs to be done.
Totally. Awesome. Thank you for that.
Yep.
So next question, somebody asks, some of these stories are so different than what you learn in an art history class. What is the research process like for these stories that as an art history undergrad, I've never heard anywhere else?
Ooh, that is such a good question. So it really begins first with a lot of memories that I've had while I've been coming up in art history. So both undergraduate and graduate school, and then further into when I was doing some PhD coursework. So sometimes it's just those little nuggets that I've remembered while reading textbooks early on. And then sometimes it's just a lot of Googling around. So I think something that's really helped me is about the year after I began the podcast, I started thinking about things more thematically. So I started asking or coming up with episodes that were around a topic like rivalries in art history or true crime and its connection to fine art. So those things have kind of helped me to start originally by just searching online and seeing where I can find the information. And then from there, I've got a great resource that not everybody is lucky enough to have. And so I'm very, very, very lucky in that I work at an art museum. So when I'm actually physically at the museum and not in my home, I have an art resource library that's steps away from my office. And so it has periodicals, biographies, every art book by basically and about every artist you can possibly imagine. And if we don't have something physically on site, then we have an interlibrary loan process with a ton of wonderful universities in our area. I am based in the Research Triangle area of North Carolina. So we've got incredible institutions, educational institutions all around us. So the ability to access anything, books, magazines, research papers is really incredible. And so I've been really lucky in that that is what helps me research the episodes and also the book itself. Could not have done it without librarians. Librarians, they help. They're the best. They are the best.
So you kind of touched on this, but Lori would like to know, does the North Carolina Museum of Art support your projects and support your podcast and book writing projects, or is it something that you do on your own, kind of using those resources there?
That's another good question. My gosh, you guys are on your game today. I love it.
You're crushing
it. They are so good. That's a good question. You know, it's something that I didn't, by no means did I keep it a secret, especially at the beginning, but I didn't want it to be seen as something that was interfering at all with my job as a curator. And that was one of the reasons why to this day, I still haven't really covered a whole lot that reaches into contemporary art territory, because that is the primary focus of my day job. So I didn't want it to be seen as something that was connected or linked together, or like I was poaching my job, for example, in some way. I don't think that would have even been the case, even if I had started a contemporary art podcast. I don't think it would have been a conflict of interest, I suppose. But I just wanted to be very careful and keep my worlds separate. So very early on, I didn't really talk about it really with many people. My friends obviously knew, some of my coworkers I knew, but it was really something that I just kept as like my personal baby. Now, of course, I've been very grateful and lucky that the podcast itself has grown. And then of course, with the book coming out, it's reached a bigger audience and more people. And so it's not a secret, obviously, anymore, but I still very much don't really rely on the museum to help publicize it. Every once in a while, I'll get, you know, the PR team will put something out just to link to something I've been doing. But in general, it's still my own personal baby.
Awesome. There is a Diane Beckman in the chat that says, "We are so proud of Jennifer at the NCMA where she is a volunteer."
Diane is the best. I know Diane personally, and she's amazing, as all of our docents and volunteers. I say it over and over and over, but that's because it is true to the nth degree. For any institution, your volunteer staff, your docents for museums, your educational staff, especially people who are giving of their time like that, it's invaluable. And you cannot have a museum like mine without them. It's just can't.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, and thank you, Diane, so much for being here today. Another great question from Donna. She says, "My 18-year-old son is definitely in the I don't like art camp. What would you suggest as a gentle introduction for people like him? We've been to Paris and seen the Mona Lisa, so he's been exposed, but he doesn't seem to have an affinity for it."
Ooh, I feel like I can give you two thoughts. The first one is coming from the parental side of me, which, as if you have an 18-year-old, you're definitely more experienced in parenting than I am. I have a 5-year-old, but I would say don't push it. Obviously, you want it to not be like a forceful thing, but I would say show him something. I've been thinking a lot about art and movies recently. So I would say show him something that's akin to like the Thomas Crown Affair, or even the first James Bond movie, that Dr. No, that has a stolen painting as part of the evil villain's lair. I would say just introduce movies or kind of pop culture elements that bring the world of art to life a little bit, even if it's very dramatic and obviously not really real life. But those kind of things, even the Da Vinci Code, for goodness sake, even those things are just a little bit of a hint that can hopefully get you interested more. And probably the real life story in art might not be quite as exciting or, dangerous, but it's enough sometimes, I think, to just get the mind interested. Try that. Let me know how it goes.
I love it. Kathleen asks, was modern and contemporary art your favorite genre of art before you became a curator in North Carolina, or did it become your favorite after starting to work there? Do you have a second or other favorite genre?
Yes, I have third, fourth, fifth, sixth, I've got so many different favorites. My specialty when I was coming up in grad school, not only for my master's program, but it just got really dark in here. So sorry, hopefully you can still see. When I was doing my master's program, and then a little bit later when I was doing some PhD coursework, my specialty was 18th and 19th century French painting. So prior to the Impressionists, so we're talking about the stop line being kind of Manet, Courbet, before you get into the post-Impressionists and Impressionists later. So that's the stuff that I really love, love, love. And it wasn't until I was working towards my PhD program that I was asked as a student at that point at my university to have not only a major area of emphasis, which was the French painting, but I also needed 2 areas of minor emphases. And so that was when one of my professors suggested that it made sense that I would move into the modern and contemporary art sections, just from a timeline standpoint. It made some thematic sense. So I started taking contemporary art courses, and the same thing kind of happened that happened with me with art in the first place, which was that I really thought it wasn't going to be something I was interested in. And it wasn't until I started learning about it, and then again hearing those stories and hearing about the artists and their lives, why they created what they created, that just changed everything for me. And so now I focus on it full time. So it's crazy. But other things that I love, I always think that if I could go back and, go back to school and could do anything all over again, I love Asian art so much, like historical Asian art. I love myself some like ancient Buddhist sculpture, love it. Tibetan scroll painting, I'm all for it. I also love like medieval tapestries, I think are fascinating. Flemish and Dutch art. I love Rembrandt. He's one of my favorite artists ever. So I really feel like, what's not to love? There's so much to love.
There really is. And you can read about so much of it in ArtCurious. So Duke says, how can I use this book? And I'll broaden that to kind of your work more broadly, to help kids enjoy art more? Is there a good way to appropriately share some of these stories with younger readers? I want to know if you have any other stories just kind of off the top of your head that would appeal to younger kids more.
Ooh, okay. There's one that I'm definitely thinking of that's part of the book that it's a little rude, I suppose you could say, maybe a little vulgar. So it depends on your style, your point of view, and probably how young your kid is. But there is a chapter in the book on Hieronymus Bosch and his famous painting, The Garden of Earthly Delights, that's in the Prado. And basically the whole chapter is about this incredible painting that is a lot of fire and brimstone, especially the last panel, which is basically a hellscape. But it's the most ridiculous, it's terrifying, and also just random and hilarious hellscape you've ever seen painted. And this college student about 5 or 10 years ago zoomed in, and it's not a hidden figure by any means, but this is a seriously packed canvas. Definitely look it up if you don't already have a vision in your head. Panels, excuse me, not canvas. And there's a figure that has musical notes written on his gluteus maximus. And she was a music major, and she said, you know what, I bet I can translate that into modern music notation. And she did. And she basically, from what I know, at about 1:30 in the morning, recorded it on her computer and uploaded it onto YouTube. And then it just exploded. And people call it the butt song from hell. And it's just become this meme. Many years ago, I mean, even people like Anderson Cooper were talking about it on their show, and it's been appropriated by people who have done Gregorian chant versions, heavy metal versions of it. People have written lyrics. So I would say it's sort of the same way that I get into art or got into it when I was younger. Just find those weird stories that will make you laugh as much as anything else. And I think for kids, I think that humor aspect really goes a long way. So again, that particular story might not necessarily be your style, but I would find something funny about art and just see where that can take you.
I love that so much. Somebody else is asking, do you have any advice for history of art students wanting to become a curator?
That is a great question. I would say I have a lot of advice. Number one is go see art as much as you can within your personal feelings of safe space. Right now, I know that's kind of a big question, but I would say when you feel up to it, go to museums, especially free institutions, because I know that some can be really pricey. But go see galleries, go see what people are making in community art centers just down the street from you. Again, use Google Arts and Culture, just skim around. Because for me, I think the most important thing is just seeing what's being made. It's not necessarily knowing what it's all about or learning all the backstories and the history. That can come later. Really just getting interested in seeing what's going on, I think, is one of the most important parts. The second thing is that if you have the opportunity to volunteer or get an internship at an arts organization in any capacity, whether or not you want to be a curator or if you're just looking to get into any department of a museum, I think that's a really big help. So even if you're trying to go in and see what it's like to be in the PR department, or what is it like to be an intern for an educator, for example, that all can have a big impact on you getting forward and moving forward in a potential career in a museum. The other thing that I like to do, especially when I was first starting, is I like to just look at art periodicals in a library. So you don't have to read all the articles. What I would do is, again, just look. So just get a feel by flipping through a magazine and see what's, again, being made right now, what people are thinking about, how they're working, what they're preoccupied with, and then also see what really intrigues you. Because if you find something that you're really excited about, then you'll want to know more, and then that will make you more engaged. And the more that you're engaged in what you're doing, the better for everybody, especially you.
Sorry, muted myself. We are a little bit short on time, but I would love to know any stories that didn't make it into the book that you can share that maybe won't be on the pod.
Yes. So it ended up being, it's in the book, but it's only one of those little sidebar sections. And originally I had intended to do an entire chapter on still life paintings, because I think the idea, especially for people who don't know a whole lot about art or just learning, is that you look at a still life and it's like a bowl of fruit, a bouquet of flowers, and you look at it and you think, okay, that's pretty. Next. And it seems like there's not a lot going on. But the fact of the matter is that still lifes, especially in the Northern European 17th century, 16th century, that's when still lives became really of interest and very popular in art in those areas. And the idea was because they were very symbolic in that they were memento mori or vanitas paintings. So things that were meant to represent that death was basically coming for you. So they were a reminder of the part that time was passing, your life is fleeting. Don't be excited about the vanities of life and like jewelry and money because you can't take it with you and you are going to die. So those paintings are exceptionally dark in a lot of ways. And I think that is one of those things that just gets forgotten. So I wrote a whole chapter, and it wasn't until the chapter was already done that I was going back and I decided it kind of felt, it was really interesting, but it didn't feel like it was hitting the right beats for me. So that was when I scrapped it, and I decided it could just be a sidebar. So, but yes, there's so much about still lives that are fascinating.
Love that. Love it, love it. So we are kind of out of time. Before we wrap up though, Jennifer, I would love to know what you're reading right now, if anything.
Oh, yes, I am. I actually brought a book upstairs with me to my office because I have been tinkering with it. So this is a book that I'm reading right now. It's called The Truffle Underground, and it's by Ryan Jacobs. I think it came out, you're nodding, Beth. Have you seen this one?
It's a good one. Yeah.
It's so good. It's basically, it's a mystery about the goings on in the truffle underworld. So we're talking true crime and fungus, and it's fantastic. So if you want to learn new, interesting things about the food market, that's been great. I tend to read multiple books at once. So I'm also reading the second Harry Potter book, and I know Harry Potter is a little controversial right now. J.K. Rowling, at least, is a little controversial, but I'm rereading Chamber of Secrets, but I'm reading it in French because I am trying very slowly to improve upon my French, which is very mediocre. So I'm doing what I can.
Love it. Yeah. All about self-betterment in this COVID world. Duke Brown and some people on the YouTube chat want to wish you happy anniversary.
Oh my goodness.
Are you happy anniversary?
It's my wedding anniversary today.
Thank lovely. You. Happy anniversary.
Thank you.
Well, Jennifer, we are out of time, but I'll remind everybody that the link to ArtCurious, the book, is in the chat. Jennifer's podcast, ArtCurious, is releasing some really great throwback episodes right now. And we thank everybody in the audience for joining us this afternoon. Jennifer, thank you so much for this really, really fun talk. Such a nice Saturday hour to spend.
This has been so fun. Thank you so much. And thank you for everybody to participate and asking such awesome questions. And this was so much fun. Thank you.
Definitely. Again, Politics in Prose really very personally feels and appreciates every single book sale that we're getting right now. Small businesses are busting their butts trying to get through this pandemic, and bookstores in particular are feeling it. So anything that you can contribute to Politics in Prose is really appreciated right now. We hope that everybody stays well, and most importantly, stays well read. So happy afternoon, everybody. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.